Gotham Knights is a single-player or multiplayer story-driven game released on October 21st, 2022. The game is set in Gotham and follows four iconic members of the Bat family after Bruce Wayne, the Batman, dies at the start of the game. In the game, you're able to explore an open Gotham City, with action brawler mechanics being your main form of combat. However, in addition to a skill tree, players must seek out and customize their gear that they find in the world. Gotham Knights has consistently received a lot of criticism, and some of it I agree with, whereas other criticism I consider to be unfair. Now, I've enjoyed the game since launch, but I'll admit it wasn't easy to say that I love it. While I thought it was fun, for a while I had a lot of conflict on my feelings on the game. There are many details about Gotham Knights that I don't like, and many of those details actively bothered me. However, after long consideration and a recent return to the game, I've discovered a newfound affection for the game. While I do still have criticisms of Gotham Knights, it's also true that I enjoy it a lot, which led me to finally realize that yes, I do love Gotham Knights. And in today's video, I'll be talking about my feelings on the game.
Stars and Stripes!
Hello and welcome to another Carrot Scraps video, and by another, I mean the 148th. So as usual, a couple of disclaimers up front before we start the video. This video is yet another in a long series of ramble reviews that I've uploaded to the channel, which basically means that this video is not scripted. I do have a list of notes that I'll be looking at throughout the video, but generally I'll be rambling about my thoughts on the game. In addition, I also wanted to mention that the gameplay that you'll be seeing in the video is from my PlayStation 5 copy of Gotham Knights, although I do want to play the game on PC soon to see what that's like. Anyway, without further ado, let's talk about why I love Gotham Knights. So combat is really interesting in Gotham Knights because I feel like it's one of the first things that I wasn't sure about. Once I started playing the game that first night that I tried it out, it's just a little bit off. And I feel like it's a little bit off because I'm so familiar with other superhero brawlers, and I have to imagine that other people who played the game felt similarly. I play Avengers a lot, I play, the Batman Arkham games a lot, and I play the Insomniac Spider-Man games a lot. And yet Gotham Knights feels very different than those games, especially Spider-Man and especially Avengers in my opinion. The thing is, it's not a bad thing though. It's intentionally made that way to make it more interesting, and they approached combat in a new way that is built more around timing your hits than it is just kind of focusing on counters or parries. It's not a better system, it's not a bad system, it's just a different system, and once I figured that out and once I realized that it was trying something new and that I just needed to learn the combat language that it was trying to teach me, I got really excited about the game. And I feel like that encompasses a lot of Gotham Knights. I feel like a lot of Gotham Knights is doing something that the player isn't quite sure about or isn't quite expecting, and having to trust the game to see that it's doing something that it wants to try. I feel like a lot of people judge this game in a lot of different ways, as if it doesn't realize what it's doing, as if it doesn't know what it's trying to be, but I think you just need to trust the game and realize that it is going for something specific, and if you trust it and try what it's showing you, you'll find that it's actually something pretty cool and pretty interesting. Gotham Knights hasn't just been released amongst a number of other superhero brawlers, but it's also not part of the Arkhamverse, and so I feel like it has to fight expectations of players on many different fronts. But the fact that it's trying something new with the story, and it's trying something new with gameplay and combat, is something that should be embraced in my opinion. It's something that excites me about the game. And even though I was apprehensive at the start, and even though it took me a little getting used to, and even though switching between Avengers and Gotham Knights can be a little confusing going back and forth, I think once I trusted the game, it's really paying off. In the end, I really enjoy the combat. I think it's really fun, and it's a great power fantasy of its own that is similar to other superhero games, but distinctly unique. Now, while combat is something that I think is done really well in Gotham Knights, and while it's something that I celebrate, and while it's something that attracts me to the game, when I want to play Gotham Knights, I'm thinking about how much I enjoy the combat, I will say that a criticism I do have is of the enemies. things. You see, while there are many enemies that are fun to interact with, there are also a number of enemies and behaviors from those enemies that don't feel fun necessarily, or that don't mix with the combat very well, in my opinion. There are some enemies that just repeat the same attack over and over, and that aren't necessarily fun to counter. There are other enemies that use projectile weapons, such as guns and drones, that seem to lock onto you a little too closely, and they just end up being frustrating instead of fun. And then there are some of the tankier enemies which are definitely built to take a punch, but that sometimes take a little bit too many punches, in my opinion. They become punching sponges, the equivalent of a bullet sponge from another game. Now in the end, I do enjoy combat in Gotham Knights, and I enjoy fighting most of the enemies in the game. This isn't an overwhelming feeling throughout, it's just occasionally I do get bothered by the enemies that I interact with, and I wish that they behaved slightly differently so that way it was a little bit more fun. So already you can tell there's this push and pull with Gotham Knights, where when I give a compliment, there's also a slight criticism that I have. And another example of that is traversal. Now on one hand, traversal is handled really well in Gotham Knights. I think it's one of the best and most unique things about the game, especially when you compare it to other superhero games. One of my favorite parts of Arkham Knight was piloting the Batmobile. I think adding that kind of traversal option for a game like that makes a lot of sense. And the motorcycle in Gotham Knights is a great version of that. Getting a superhero vehicle to drive around this open world is really nice. I was incredibly excited to use this motorcycle before the game came out, and similar to combat, when I first started using it in game, I wasn't having a lot of fun because it didn't play the way that I expected. But sure enough, if I learned the language it was trying to teach me, I realized that it just needed to be controlled slightly differently. And once I realized what that difference was, I've had so much fun ever since piloting this motorcycle. One of my favorite things to do in Gotham Knights is just drive around the city, and of course drive around and stop crime, but in general I just like driving and seeing the sights. Each of the 4 characters have their own version of the glide, and their traversal is slightly different between them. For example, Batgirl uses her cape to glide, Dick Grayson uses a Fortnite-style glider, Robin uses teleporting tech, and then Red Hood uses a spiritual jump that hops him from place to place. Now, as I'm sure you can tell, some of these traversal options for these characters are expected, while others were a little controversial once they were premiered at launch. And here's the thing, I was one of those people who were skeptical about some of these choices. But I also like that they tried to do something a little different with each character, to justify the reason for switching between each of them, and I think changing their traversal so much is one great way to highlight the differences between them. In the end, I think I like all of their traversal options in their own way, especially Red Hood, who I feel like I was probably most skeptical of before launch. I think Robin's teleporting tech is what I'm least impressed by, and it's the traversal that I'm the least interested in. That being said, I think that's just because it's so radically different than the other 3. I think once I meet it on its own terms, there's a chance I might enjoy his traversal a little bit more, if I accept him as his own character instead of a variant of others. So again, there's a push and pull of expectations and then execution. And then the thing is, I like these traversal options, but there are some details about each of them that are a little odd and that I think could have been tweaked just a bit. For example, I really like Red Hood's jump, but sometimes he just gets thrown in a weird direction or doesn't trigger when I want it to, and I'll find myself running into a building and just falling from a height instead of, hopping from place to place. But I think in general, this is a really successful part of the Gotham Knights puzzle, and I think it's a part of the game that the team should be proud of because it came out really well. Something else I wanted to mention about traversal before we move on are the Knighthood challenges. These challenges are actually what unlock the glide for each of these characters, and I have to say, again, this is something that I really disliked about the game starting out, and over time that I've become a little bit more kind towards. At first, I really disliked the idea of hiding the glide behind challenges. I feel like it's an important part of a game like this. I feel like the game is designed around this kind of traversal, and removing it from the character just didn't make a lot of sense to me. And I'll admit, to an extent, I still kind of agree with that sentiment. I still feel like you should have this glide early on. But as I played it, I realized that these challenges aren't super difficult. If you're trying to get this glide early, you can get it pretty quickly. Plus, it's tied to a progression of the character's personal story that I think is really interesting. So once again, and again, I'll try not to say this over and over, but with the thing that I love, there's also something that I'm not the biggest fan of, but in the end, I think the knighthood challenges are something that I'm not necessarily a fan of, but something that I don't necessarily hate either. But in general, the traversal in Gotham Knights is one of the highlights of the game, and I really enjoy using it. Now let's talk about another controversial part of Gotham Knights, and that would be the gear. Now, gear is controversial because we just got a superhero gear game in the form of Avengers. In addition, I feel like a lot of people conflate live service with looter brawlers or looter shooters, and so I think there are a lot of negative connotations that come with this style of gameplay. And to be fair, there are a lot of problems with looter shooters in my experience. If you've watched the channel for a while, you know that I'm not the most experienced with looter shooters or looter brawlers, but I've learned with time that there are some serious pitfalls with this style of gameplay design. For example, one problem could be not designing good challenges, but instead hiding that challenge behind an artificial number, having the player seek out better gear to overcome powerful characters, just finding the bigger number to attack the smaller number. And I can see both why that might be compelling for some, but how that can be extremely dull for others. And when it comes to gear in Gotham Knights, I have to admit I don't have a lot to say about this part of the game. It's not a part of the game that I'm particularly interested in. I'm happy that it's something that other people seem to really love, but for me it's still not a draw for me. I'm not that person, it's just not my style of gameplay. It's something that I'm willing to try and something that I'm not against, but it's just not my favorite. That being said, in Gotham Knights, I feel like the gear is done okay. I think it's done perfectly fine. I never disliked any of the gear that I got, but I also didn't necessarily get excited for gear. I did think that it was interesting that gear was connected to visual cosmetic changes, at least slightly, and I was excited to be more powerful. I did feel really powerful when I got new gear, I think in a way that I haven't felt in other looters. I think Gotham Knights did that particularly well. When I get new gear, I just feel like I'm a powerhouse suddenly, and that's cool, that's rewarding. But I also didn't feel like I was getting as much gear as I did in Avengers, for example. And I feel like I liked the gear in Avengers more because I was getting more of it and because I sought it out, at least until I hit that power level ceiling. Whereas in Gotham Knights, I feel like the number is a little nebulous, and I also run into so little gear that I'm not that passionate about that it kind of falls on deaf ears eventually. Now, there are a couple of other details about Gotham Knights that still don't work for me entirely. I think there are just some weird edges that are a little rough that just don't feel finished. For example, sometimes button presses don't work the way that I want them to. I'll go to do a stealth takedown and I'll press the proper button, the screen will tell me what button to press, and then for some reason I do a ranged attack instead. And there's nothing more infuriating than the game telling you to do something, basically assuring you that there will be a response to your action, and then when you follow their instruction, you do the wrong thing and basically ruin an entire encounter. This didn't happen all the time, but it happened a couple of times that really did frustrate me. So it's something that is a little bothersome about the game that I wish was a little bit more worked out. In addition, when it comes to other disappointing aspects of Gotham Knights, I do think that some of the mission objectives in the game just aren't super interesting. There are a couple moments throughout the story where you just have to interrogate certain individuals and go from, crime boss to crime organization to gang, and just interrogate random individuals. And it just felt like busy work for a little while. It felt like padding. I could see how those missions could be interesting if they were built a little bit differently, but there were multiple times throughout the Gotham Knights story where I felt, because of the objectives, that the game felt a little monotonous and just not very fun. That being said, to counter those criticisms, I think there are also a number of other mission objectives that I really like. I also really like a lot of the detective work in the game. I think the detective work in the game can be really fun sometimes. The stealth is done really well, and it's refreshing to have another superhero stealth game that works and is fun. Case files are these interesting dungeon-like missions where you get to go into this closed area and take on a specific villain from the Bat family, and I really liked this part of the game as well. I'm also a big fan of map-style games, and seeing all of the missions generated on your map is pretty cool, and I like a lot of the objectives here. I liked the premeditated crimes and the variety between them. I also really liked the traversal challenges and the motorcycle challenges. I liked looking at the map and driving in a direction and finding out what I would do next. I thought there was a really cool variety of missions and objectives for you to do in the overworld. And I think for now, those are my thoughts on gameplay. So with that out of the way, let's talk about presentation in Gotham Knights. Now, of course, when it comes to presentation, we're talking about writing, we're talking about graphics, we're talking about story, and everything in between. First of all, I want to say that Gotham Knights is beautiful when it comes to environments. I love the design and the rendering of a lot of the way the world looks. I love the way Gotham looks. It's a mixture of this gothic, moody, sad environment, but also it's a little lively. I like that there are storefronts. I like that there's this mixture of architecture. I really like their version of Gotham in Gotham Knights, and it's a part of the video game world that I like to explore and walk through. It's cool to just stop and look and see what they've created. In addition, it's a very different Gotham when it comes to tone. It's definitely always night and it's always raining, so again, you have that kind of dark, depressing mood, but it seems as if the people of Gotham respond to you, and that's really cool in my opinion. I like the kind of variety of interactions that you get from the people of Gotham. Some people are excited to see the hero, and some people dislike you and call you a vigilante and want you to leave immediately. I like this range of interaction, and it actually makes the world feel more lived in. Even though you can't really do much with these environments, you can't walk into interiors or anything like that, or at least many interiors, just these simple little interactions and these variety of interactions between the four different heroes, and also the way that they are approached and the tone of how they're approached, all of those little interactions make the world feel a little bit bigger and make the atmosphere of Gotham feel just a little bit more alive, and I think that's really cool. In addition, costumes in this game look incredible. I really like the mix that they have of references and original designs, and I think they've all come out really well, and you have a lot of really interesting looks between the four characters. In addition, you get to switch these looks around and change minor options to make your look a little bit more unique. Also, like I mentioned earlier, I like that gear does have a specific look to it, but you also have the ability to change your cosmetic at any time, which is a nice flexibility that I wasn't expecting. Now, when it comes to the people of Gotham Knights, I think they look okay. I think there are some characters that don't look the best. I don't know, I feel like most characters don't look incredible. It's not like they look bad, they just don't look as good as other games that are coming out right now, in my opinion. I think there are a couple of characters that look fantastic. I think that Batgirl looks really good, I think that Mr. Freeze looks really good, I think that Alfred looks really good, but even though I like Nightwing, even though I love Red Hood, I'm not the biggest fan of the way that their character models look. Again, I'm not saying that these are bad necessarily, they're just not necessarily great. They're not incredible renders of these characters outside of the costume, in my opinion. Now, something that I do feel a little bit more comfortable about saying that I dislike in Gotham Knights is the UI. The menus in this game, in my opinion, look awful. Just some of the worst UI design that I've seen in a video game for a long time. It looks almost like a free app game that you'd get on your phone from the App Store. It really doesn't look good. And what's worse is that, you know, obviously it's a small detail about the game, right? Like, it's not one of the bigger details, but in my opinion, this discourages me from exploring the menus in the game. And unfortunately, because it's a game based around gear and even based around the map and looting and missions, that I feel less likely to explore those menus, and oftentimes I don't want to go through those menus because they just don't look good. I don't know, this is something that I felt before launch, and after launch I feel even more strongly. It's one of the few details that I still feel exactly the same about, if not worse. The UI just doesn't look good, I apologize, and I think it has a negative effect on the game, unfortunately. It's not the end of the world, but it's definitely one of the bigger details in Gotham Knights that I think is just flatly bad. But let's change our course and talk about something good again. When it comes to story, I think Gotham Knights is awesome, and it's also really creative. In fact, I think the more creative elements about the story and the way the story is told is part of why I like it so much, more so than the actual events. Now, as I mentioned, Batman dies at the beginning of the game, and the story is about these four heroes from the Bat family coming together and trying to function together to be the hero that Gotham needs, to rise to the occasion, to go from sidekicks to their own heroes. Now, what's really interesting about the game is that you can play the story from each of their perspectives. In fact, you could play the whole game as just one character and get one very different story than you would if you played as another character. Now, to be clear, it's not like you get different endings, it's not like you get different pathways when it comes to missions, but when it comes to character interactions and when it comes to personal character growth, you almost get an entirely different game when it comes to those little events if you play as a different character. When I was first playing the game, I specifically wanted to beat it as Batgirl, and that was just because I was surprised by how much it felt like its own game. It didn't feel like I was playing a version of Gotham Knights, it felt like Gotham Knights was a Batgirl story, and I was convinced that I needed to play it as Batgirl first, but towards the end of my playthrough, I decided to switch it up a little bit more, and again, I was surprised at how different each of the other playthroughs were. I finished the game as Jason Todd, and again, when the credits rolled, it felt like that final cutscene was only about Jason. It felt like I had just finished a game for Jason Todd, and to me, I think that's really cool, and I think it adds a lot of replay value to the game, and it's also just neat how much respect they dropped on each of these four characters. It doesn't feel like you got less because they had four options for you to choose from, and that's awesome. Now, when it comes to the story itself, I don't necessarily think it's the most groundbreaking. I think some of the events are a little cliche, and I am surprised by the amount of screen time that certain groups get. I don't want to go too much into spoilers, but there's a part of me that feels like it's a little odd that certain characters or groups weren't featured as much as they could have been, or in my opinion, should have been. It felt like they were going for a big twist moment, but in the end, I just felt like we got less of some characters or some organizations that I felt like I wanted to see more of, and I felt like the game was kind of promising we would have seen more of. But that being said, I feel like the true highlights of this story come from exploring these various groups, who they are and where they are and what they're doing, but more importantly than that, these characters, these four protagonists, and exploring who they are is the main core of this story. It's clearly what they were focusing on, and I think they really succeeded, so I don't think it matters too much that the story, events, and the plot aren't the most complex. I feel like I've said that a lot about superhero games recently, but it's true, what can I say? When I play Gotham Knights, I'm not necessarily playing for the plot events, I'm playing because I want to learn more about these four characters, and learning more about those four characters are the most interesting parts of the story and the revelations that come with it. Now, with that being said, let's talk about characters a little bit more, and before I do that, I wanted to mention something a little bit more personal. Now, back in the day, I used to read DC Comics specifically before I got into Marvel. My family knew someone who reviewed comic books and media, such as magazines and novels, and so they'd get a lot of free copies of stuff, and they would give me all of their free copies of stuff once they didn't want it anymore. And for whatever reason, they reviewed DC a lot, and I got a lot of DC as a result. And those were some of my first comic books that I was actually reading, not just looking at the pictures, but reading the stories of. And some of those first stories happened to be Batman stories. And so I did have a pretty close connection to the Bat family and Batman specifically when it came to superheroes and comic book stories. But over time, once I started getting my own legs and getting my own money and income and spending money on the characters that I wanted to explore personally instead of just the ones that were available to me, I decided to explore Marvel, and the rest is history. I'm a Marvel boy through and through, even though I still love DC. But the thing is, I've kind of waned off of Batman in those years. I've never disliked Batman, but I've definitely become less and less infatuated with that character as time has gone on. But what's great about Gotham Knights, and what I absolutely love about this game, is that it's encouraged me to get back into the Bat family. I think they did such a great job with Gotham Knights that it got me excited again to check out the world of Batman and the Bat family, and I really love that. I think that's so cool that an interpretation of these characters and this mythology can be so good to rejuvenate a new interest in that property. And I'm sure there are plenty of people who had the same feeling, or who started Batman comics or the world of Batman initially because of this game. And so if that was a goal of the devs, congratulations, I think that's awesome. Now specifically, I wanted to mention Red Hood. Red Hood is a character that I'm very familiar with. One of my best friends growing up is a huge Red Hood fan, and so we'd talk about the character all the time. And we'd often talk about the Robins and all of the different iterations of the Bat family. And I realized recently that I didn't have a favorite Robin, and I wasn't sure why that was. And it wasn't easy for me to just pick one because it had been a long time since I had really engaged with the property. Now, when it came to Gotham Knights, I figured that Red Hood might be my least favorite character because I just didn't think that a character built around ranged attacks would be as interesting as some of the other melee characters. But I tried the character towards the end of my playthrough, and I was shocked by how much I enjoyed Red Hood's gameplay. Jason is awesome. He is potentially my favorite character in the game. I was loving Batgirl so much to the point where I didn't want to play the other characters, but I'm so happy that I decided to give these other characters a shot because I just can't believe how much I enjoy playing as the Red Hood. And so as a result, I pretty much play him all the time, and I think he's really cool because he's just awesome. Getting to take down a group of criminals as Red Hood is just so dope. His animations are incredible, and I just feel super powerful as the character. I am really surprised at how much I enjoy playing as him. But the other thing that I love about Red Hood in this game is his character. I really like the approach to Jason in this game, and I really like who he is as opposed to the other iterations of him in other media. It feels in general like there is a sincerity that comes with Gotham Knights as a whole, but with Jason Todd specifically. And that sincerity is something that I feel like I don't see as often in the Batman family, but again, often as Jason Todd. We don't really see these sincere looks with Jason Todd and at his character, at least in my opinion, in other iterations of his story. And so I feel like they've done something really unique with this version of the Bat family, but this version of Jason as well. All of that to say, this combat, this wonderful combat mixed with this very different, sincere, transparent version of Jason's character has caused him to become one of my favorite comic book characters, or at least one of my favorite characters in the Bat family. I love Jason Todd now, and a lot of that love, basically all of that love, comes from this version of him, comes from the Gotham Knights version of the character, which again is very similar to my love for the Black Widow, a character that I wasn't super interested in but was familiar with and didn't dislike until playing Avengers, where I became really fascinated with that character. I had always been interested in Jason Todd and his story, but getting to play as him in this game, seeing his combat combined with a version of his character that I really like, has really elevated him when it comes to my list of favorite superheroes. I think he's awesome. I do wish that his character model looked a little different, but in the end, that's nothing compared to all of the other great qualities about the character in the game. But even though I had this big revelation about Jason, I can't stress enough how much I love the other members of the Bat family in this game. Barbara, Dick, Tim, and Jason are all great versions of these characters, and they're all really interesting in their own ways. And of course, their gameplay reflects that as well. It's a combination of these new takes on these characters, but also this interesting look at their combat and the way that they navigate the world. I really love switching between these characters and learning more about them. This love even extends to Alfred, which is something I really wasn't expecting about the game when I first started playing. Each of these 5 characters are so well done, and I'm always happy to see them do more in the game. Now, I will say, while I celebrated the way that they approach telling the story from each character's perspective, it does feel a little disjointed sometimes when you get a cutscene at the wrong time. You can kind of just play these cutscenes at any point of the story, and that's part of what makes them work, but sometimes they don't always work, so it's not a huge criticism, but every now and again, the cutscenes can feel a little out of place or a little not substantial just because of how they were placed. But in general, I think that the cutscenes and these characters and the way that you can play as any character throughout the story is done really well in Gotham Knights. And again, going back to sincerity, I feel like one of the biggest details about this game that I love is how sincere it is. I feel like the Bat family and Batman stories in general in other media tend to be a little too moody, a little too dark and gritty, and a little too jaded. I'm not saying every story is like that, but many of them are, and it's just super refreshing to me to get to play Gotham Knights and to see the jaded, gritty, dark, depressing parts of Gotham, but also to get so many different parts of the sincere aspects of Gotham too, both in the world when people speak to you and talk to you and are excited to see these superheroes, but also the main cast, whether they're just showing love for each other or whether they're really struggling with their own inner turmoil. You know, sometimes these moments can be really corny. There are a lot of moments in Gotham Knights that make me roll my eyes, that are a little too silly, a little too goofy, or just don't feel real because they're so corny. I think corny is the best way to describe it. But the thing is, these corny moments are risky. The game and the developers are risking these corny moments for sincerity, and I think even if they do have the occasional corny moment that doesn't work, in general they're succeeding. They're succeeding in showing a unique version of these characters, and I love that, and it's one of the many reasons that I love Gotham Knights. So that's how I feel about the game. As you can tell, I'm still pretty conflicted on some stuff. I have a lot of complicated feelings about the game, and I have a lot of criticisms about it, but as usual, just because I'm critical of something, that doesn't mean I can't like it. As I always like to say, I don't read comic books because they're perfect and free of criticism. I read them because I like them. I have plenty of criticisms of comic books, but I still read them, and the same is true of Gotham Knights. I love this game. I love the combat, even though it took me a little bit to get used to, and I think it's incredibly fun to master, and it's super enjoyable to see done well. I love the world that you inhabit and the way that you traverse through it. I love how different each of the characters act, but how different each of them play as well. But most importantly, I love how sincere this game is, and how brave it was to take a new spin on one of the most iconic franchises in the world. So yes, for those reasons and more, I love Gotham Knights. Anyway, that's gonna do it for this video. I want to thank you so much for watching. If for some reason you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and to subscribe to my channel for more. As regular viewers know, I make a variety of content on my channel, and I'm always gonna make the videos that I want to make. But if you see something you enjoy, make sure to let me know, and I'll try to prioritize that kind of content in the future. Over on Twitch, I typically play superhero games like Marvel's Avengers and Gotham Knights, with the occasional horror game like Resident Evil. So if that sounds interesting to you at all, make sure to check me out on Twitch at twitch.tv/carrotscraps. And all my other social media, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram are at carrotscraps as well. So I want to thank you again so much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Gotham Knights is a single-player or multiplayer story-driven game released on October 13th, 2022. That's not the date at all. I just put in a random date in October because I knew it came out in October. Oh my god, that's so funny. I just put down any day in October. What is wrong with me?